have one screen.
And we're going to let a couple more people, I'll keep letting them in as they come, but
Okay.
let's go ahead and we'll get started since it's 1:40. Hi, everybody. This is Debbie Hockman from the David Pasternak JCC. And we are once again happy to join with the Friends of the Sterling Road Library to bring another edition of Linda Levin's book discussion.
Right.
So a couple things though, just a couple housekeeping things. Linda and I had a discussion today, and we are going to continue to do Zoom June, July, and August for sure, and probably September. So it'll be the same book that they're going to do at the Sterling Road Library in person. It'll also probably be the same week. We're going to continue I think the in-person, Linda, you said is on Thursday.
I have to double check. Marilyn, I don't know if you're on. I know Marilyn had trouble getting on, so she might be one of the ones you're letting in now. But I think they talked about, Jackie, do you know, was Thursday going to be the day we did the in-person in the library?
I haven't heard that it was changing the date, so that's new to me. I mean, they just had the board meeting, I think, last week maybe, so they may have changed it.
Okay,
well,
so
our goal is, May 17th is our next book, and it's Sparks Like Stars with Nashimi, somebody. What's it?
Nadia.
Yeah, Hashimi is her last name, right?
A few of you have started reading it already and have said how much you're enjoying it, so that's good to know. Yeah.
Right. So we will definitely, when we meet again in May, we will have a definite on. So that date is set, that May 17th, and we will give you a definite date for the June before then. But you can go ahead. Oh, look, Jillian's already. She's showing us a book. There it is. Sparks Like Stars. Nadia Hashimi. So, or Hashimi, I'm not sure. Anyway, but you can actually go and register for that today and sign up for that already. And as I said, we'll get the June date up as soon as we can. So as I said, goal is we will continue the virtual through the summer as well as in person at the Sterling Road Library. And then in the fall, we are working on some new plans. So stay tuned and we'll keep you informed of what's going on. And in the meantime, we apologize for the mix-up today. We're not exactly, I'll have to research it later to find out exactly how that happened, but we do really appreciate you taking some time out to be with us. And as always, so happy to turn it over to the lovely Linda Levin. And one thing that before I do, I just want to say one thing. Marion Sherman had written an email. Did you see it, Linda?
No.
She said that she couldn't get the book and she listened to the Audible. And she said that she really enjoyed the Audible because of the language and the accents and all that type of thing. And she liked it so much that then she did it for Sense and Sensibility. I thought that was so fun.
Okay, good.
And she's recommending that for any of you that enjoyed the book, that you listen to it again on Audible. And I told her that I would say that. And I was going to say that I too watched the film. I didn't read the book, though I had read it in high school, but that was just 5 years ago. So it was still very fresh in my mind.
That's right. Only 5 years ago.
Only 5 years ago. So, I'm a recent graduate. So nonetheless, watching it, I did watch the film. Actually, I watched it twice. So, but I will now turn it over to Linda, who will enlighten us.
Great. Okay, so I know some of you had difficulty getting through it. And it's so interesting because I don't know how many of you watched Bridgerton. Yes. How many of you watched Bridgerton? Yeah. I was picturing Bridgerton as I was reading this entire book because it was actually depicting the same time period. So as they talked about the balls and the clothing and all of that, I was envisioning that. And I think it really added to my reading. So hopefully you guys have the same experience. Okay. So let me begin before we talk about the books. Let me tell you what we came up with for June, July, and August. Okay. If you have noise in the background, guys, if you have noise in the background, mute yourselves, okay? Mute yourselves if you have noise in the background. So our upcoming books, we talked about May is going to be Sparks Like Stars. And June is a book called The Personal Librarian. The Personal Librarian by Marie Benedict. We know Marie Benedict because didn't she do, what did we read in here with her? Lady Clementine, I think.
Lady
was one.
Clementine. And another one. I think we read one other.
We did another one too, which is escaping my brain right now. But yes, I believe.
Wait, I'm gonna look at our list.
Okay, great. But that's the personal librarian for June. For July, and by the way, Jackie, I will send you this list so you can get this out. But for July, we're going to do the Paris Library. Has anyone read that one? Again, great reviews, those that have already read it. And I see nodding of heads, so that's great. The Paris Library. And that's by Janet Scaslien Charles. August is a book called Oil and Marble by Stephanie Story. Okay? So again, this received great reviews, and I think it's one that's going to offer a lot of topics for conversation. Great. So those are our upcoming books, and we will be sending that out to you.
Linda, too, I just want to make everybody aware. I am muting everybody as they come on because of the background noise. And just remember, we really can hear, and if you're on video, we can see everything going on. So just keep that in mind because it does affect everybody on the broadcast. And just to remind everybody that when you do want to be part of the conversation, you can unmute yourself at that time and speak, but please try to remute yourself because sometimes you don't realize like your dog barking or somebody's cooking in the background or those type of things, but we can all hear that. So thank you so much.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit. First of all, what's really amazing, I don't know how many of you looked up any background on Jane Austen. It is incredible how many Austen societies there are, how many theses there have been written about not only Pride and Prejudice, but all of her other books. There have been so many theories about her and the characters and all of that. There was just a plethora of information. So I have some interesting articles that I can bring to conversation with us. But I do want to go ahead and give you some background about her life, because obviously she draws from her life in terms of the content that she writes about. I want to tell you that, and then I'm going to tell you a summary. I'm going to give you a summary also, and I was trying to figure out whether I should give a brief summary, a longer summary. Hopefully I found something in between for those of you that did not get to watch the movie or read the book and did want to just hear the conversation. Okay, about the author. So here we have Jane Austen. She published this book anonymously in 3 volumes. It came out in 1813, okay? Of course, it is a classic of English literature. And upon publication, this book was well received by critics and readers. The first edition sold out immediately, and it never, ever since went out of print. It is said that Jane Austen lived a quiet life. There's only a few of her manuscripts that remain in existence, and the majority of her correspondence was either burned or heavily edited by her sister, Cassandra, shortly before she died. As a result, the details that are known about her life are rather scarce or inconsistent. But what can be surmised from the remaining letters and personal acquaintances is that she was a woman of stature, humor, and keen intelligence. Of course, that all comes through in her writing. She was born in Stevenson, Hampshire in December of 1775, and she died in 1817. She grew up in a tight-knit family. She was one of 8 children. She had 6 brothers, 1 sister. Her parents were married in 1764. Her father had been an orphan, but he was through an uncle, was able to go to a private school and finally was ordained by the Church of England. Subsequently, he had enough social standing. He was able to marry Cassandra, who came from a family of considerably higher social status. And in 1765, they moved to Sventon, where she was born, where Jane was born, and that's about 60 miles southwest of London. The father became a rector, so you see how she had all this background in the parsonages, the whole idea of people working for the church. It was her father who really encouraged her love of learning. She had 2 older brothers that also became ordained in the church, and she was closest to one brother, Henry. He was her agent, and after her death, her biographer. There was another son whose name was Edward, and he was adopted by the father's wealthy cousin. Why he's important is that in her later life, when they were pretty much financially very insecure, her family did move to this uncle's estate, and that's where Austen completed most of her novels. Cassandra was her only sister, born in 1773. They were very close friends and confidants, and neither sister ever married. And it is through these remaining letters to Cassandra that biographers have been able to piece anything together about her life. The two youngest boys, Francis and Charles, went into the Navy. They became very well-known and well-decorated admirals. And when Austen was only 7, she and her sister were sent to Oxford to attend school, but they came down with typhus, and they had to come home back to Sventon. And when she was 9, they attended a public school there, but after enrolling very shortly thereafter, their father ended up taking them out of school. They could not afford to keep them there, and it was their father that really took over their education, and that's how these two girls really learned. But what was really important in their family was every night they would read to each other. And this evolved into short theatrical performances, and Jane Austen began composing these little playlets for her family. And so she became a writer. And the family plays were performed in a barn, and they were attended by family members and a few close neighbors. By the age of 12, Jane Austen was already writing not only for herself, her family, and sometimes for neighbors. She wrote poems, she wrote parodies. What's also interesting, considering her writing, she had her own experiences with love and loss. And it's not surprising, so much of her writing has to do with marriage and love. And the story is that she won the attentions of a young Irish gentleman. His name was Tom Lafoy, and she really was quite in love with him. The problem was he was in a position that required him to marry into money. And so he later married an heiress. He became a prominent political figure in Ireland. Several years later, it's said she fell in love again with a clergyman who became ill and died. And there's a lot of details about her love life, but we know that her sister Cassandra kept everything very private, even after Jane's death. In 1795, when she was 20, she entered her productive phase, and she created something called her first trilogy. She began writing these novels, and Sense and Sensibility was published in 1811, followed by Pride and Prejudice, which, if you recall, I think it says it in all of the editions of the book, it was first called First Impressions, and that came out in 1813. She was very vain and very happy about the success of Pride and Prejudice. And by the way, Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, neither of them were published under her name. They were published anonymously. But she was so happy with the success of Pride and Prejudice, and she is known to have said, quote, "I confess, I think the character of Elizabeth is as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print, and I don't know how I shall ever be able to tolerate those who do not like her. I just don't know how I will ever tolerate them." So she really was quite in love with Elizabeth and with the story that she wrote. The family later moved to Bath, and that was sort of hard for her because there was a lot of social restrictions that she encountered in Bath. In fact, it was there that she accepted a marriage proposal from the son of an old family friend, and she changed her mind and refused him the very next day. In 1805, her father died, and it left them in pretty bad circumstances. It was Jane, Cassandra, her sister, and her mother. They did not have enough money to live comfortably, and they had to rely on the hospitality of friends and family. And it is then that they moved to the estate of this wealthy uncle, and it was there that she wrote her second trilogy. In 1814, she published Mansfield Park, 1815, Emma, and Northanger Abbey was published posthumously in 1817. She began showing signs of her illness she did not suffer long. She died actually in 1817 at the age of 41. It's now believed that she had Addison's disease, and I guess she was quite ill at the very end. And when her sister Cassandra said, "Is there anything that I can give you, anything that you're requiring?" And she said, "The only thing I require is death itself." She was really ready at that point. She knew that she was a successful writer, and so that, of course, gave her a lot of pleasure at the end. So that's a little bit about her background, and obviously a lot of her background comes forth in her writing. So I wanted to give you now a brief summary of the story for those of you that read it a while ago. What's interesting about this book is that it's not only an entertaining story, we know that it is also a study of manners against the backdrop of a very class-conscious society. This book is considered to be one of her finest, if not certainly her most famous of Austen's novels. It's set in rural England. It's at the turn of the 19th century, and it follows the Bennet family. And there's 5 very different sisters in this family. The family home is known as Longhorn, and it sits beside a beautiful estate by the name of Netherfield. And so the novel opens with what reviewers say is one of the most popular lines in English literature. And here's how it starts, if you remember. Quote, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." And they're going to talk about that, how that line really sets the tone and the theme, obviously, of the story. But this statement is what Mrs. Bennet is after. The goal of her life is to marry off these 5 girls, find suitable husbands for them. And there's a ball coming, and this guy, Bingley, has rented the estate next door. And Bingley takes an immediate interest in the oldest Bennet daughter, this beautiful and very shy girl by the name of Jane. And with Bingley, when he comes to his estate, is his friend Fitzwilliam Darcy. And even though Jane and Bingley hit it off great, Darcy and Elizabeth, the second oldest of the Bennet girls, they do not get along very well. They have a very less than cordial beginning. Throughout the novel, we see that Bingley is this good-looking, kind of gentlemanly kind of guy, well-liked wherever he goes. And Darcy, from the very first time they meet him, we know that he is described as haughty, arrogant, and he's disliked by all. Okay, so I want to refresh your memory with the characters. We've got this cousin, the Bennet cousin by the name of Mr. Collins. He arrives to the Bennet household, and he is determined to marry one of the Bennet girls. And he proposes to Elizabeth because Mrs. Bennet, the mother, and by the way, if you remember from the story, the father refers to himself, he's Mr. Bennet, she's Mrs. Bennet, the mother. Mrs. Bennet really wants Elizabeth to accept this proposal from the cousin, and of course, Elizabeth flatly turns him down. And during this same time, Elizabeth does meet this very handsome soldier by the name of Wickham, and there's a mutual attraction between the two. What's interesting is that while she's sort of interested in this handsome soldier, she finds out that the soldier and Darcy have this enmity between them, and she wants to figure out why that is. And Wickham just says to her, well, yeah, we knew each other from very long time ago. We were children together. In fact, we really have bad blood between us because Darcy denied Wickham what Wickham considered was his rightful inheritance. And of course, we'll fill in all of the blanks as we go through in our conversation. Elizabeth's initial dislike of Darcy grows. She is convinced he cheated Wickham out of his inheritance. And secondly, she is also coming to believe that Darcy has played a part in the fact that Bingley, it doesn't seem to be interested in Jane any longer. So he's sort of responsible for the breakup of that. And so it goes that she really dislikes Darcy. The truth is, though, Darcy is becoming more fond of her, and subsequently he writes Elizabeth a letter, and there's where he gives clarification, and he explains the misunderstandings they've had between them. And he explains that Wickham lied to her, didn't tell her the whole truth. In fact, he had received his inheritance, which he squandered. The problem is, by the time all this clarification is made, the youngest Bennet sister, Lydia, has fallen in love with the handsome Wickham. She doesn't know he's a cad, and she runs off with him. And the news is met with great dismay by Elizabeth and the whole family. It's a huge scandal, which of course can ruin the entire family and all of the potential prospects for the other sisters in terms of marriage. She tells Darcy of this seduction of this 16-year-old Lydia. And what we find out is that Darcy, remember what happens with him? He secretly goes into action. He helps find Lydia and Wickham. He helps resolve it all, right? He wants his intervention to remain a secret. But of course, Elizabeth does find out that he has paid off Wickham, and Wickham is now going to marry Lydia, make an honest woman of her. And in the end, of course, we see Darcy in a very different light, as does Elizabeth. And ultimately, she does accept his proposal. And the good news is Jane ends up with Bingley and happy ever after. Okay? So it shouldn't be surprising to you to know that this book is considered to be the basis or the original rom-com. You know what I mean by that? A romantic comedy. And when you think about it, it is amazing how many stories are the same contemporary stories that we all go to the movies to watch or watch for free on TV now. Okay, so before we get into all of that, let's talk about the most obvious thing, and that is the style of writing. And that's the thing I think that gave some people difficulty in terms of enjoying this book. But what strikes you about this style of writing? Let's hear some of your comments. Did you have trouble with it? Did you enjoy it? Did you find it descriptive? What do you think? Jackie, get us started.
Honestly, I had a hard time with it. Part of it was the older style of writing, but a lot of it was the double negatives. I bogged down in that because I had to go back and think, okay, now what exactly are they saying? And that did keep me a little bit stifled.
Yeah.
I want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
At the beginning, it was hard for me. Especially English is not my first language, but after I did enjoy it very, very much. I could not, I kept on reading and I could see, what the time that it was written, how all these customs were so different. And so I did learn a lot, and I really liked it very much. I like to know where you can watch the movie, but I read the book. I completed it last Saturday, and I at the end I couldn't put it down because the story was very interesting.
Good.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Eleanor? Yeah.
I had read the book years ago, and I remembered when I started reading it, and then I just could not focus on it anymore. It was such a slow read for me. I said, I know I read it. I knew the story. That's when I switched over to the movie. And I guess when I read it the first time, I was much younger and had more patience. But I thought it was a hard read.
Yeah. It definitely took more effort. There's no question. It definitely took more effort to read it. And again, because of the double negatives, because of the lengthy sentences, right? I found them very descriptive. I want to go back to that first sentence, by the way. What does it say? Why is it such a powerful sentence, a strong sentence, such a well-known sentence? Starting with this idea that it is a universally acknowledged fact, that it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So what do you think? What is it? What tone does it set for us? Any thoughts? It's
well,
funny.
that everybody must get married, and I don't think that it's true, but
right.
Yeah.
Also, that a rich guy needs a wife. I mean, it's actually a funny thought, it's funny. And you of course see the desperation of, later on, we're going to see Mrs. Bennet's desperation in trying to marry off these girls. So it sets the tone and the theme right there in that first sentence. What's interesting about, you should know what reviewers say about Jane Austen. They say, I love this one. She vividly, we know she depicts the middle class, English social life, everything that goes on. But I love this. She directs our sympathies like a Beijing traffic cop. And it's true. She starts us off with the fact that now most of us know this story. So, if you were reading it for the first time, your thoughts about Darcy would be exactly her thoughts. She right away lets us think that the best judgment in the whole book is coming from Elizabeth. And if Elizabeth says that this guy is not likable, he's not likable. And she really causes us to feel that he really is not a likable guy. So, we really see it. She really does a good job of painting those pictures. We see his pride, we see his arrogance, and we become prejudiced against him too. We believe she's trustworthy as a narrator. And of course, what we eventually learn is, like anything else in life, you can't judge a book by its cover, right? Okay. All right, so moving on. I loved the descriptive language. And let me just give you one sentence that I pulled out just to give you an idea. Think about what this one sentence is telling us, okay? And it's when Mr. Collins, who's a total buffoon and the source of a lot of humor in the story, right? So he shows up now. He is going to get one of the Bennet girls to be his wife. And of course, what's sad, what does this show us? Jane Austen is depicting here this terrible thing that women could not inherit. Do you remember this part from the story?
Yes,
And so it was going to go to this ridiculous cousin, Mr. Collins. Because he was a male, he was now going to bypass all of these daughters and he was going to inherit the estate. But he's now he says, oh, I'm such a great guy. I'm going to marry one of these girls, right? And he's going to save the whole family. Okay. So here's the sentence. In Mr. Bennet's library, so now Collins has come. In Mr. Bennet's library, he had always been sure of leisure and tranquility. And though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to always meet with folly and conceit in every other room of his house, he was at least used to being free from them there in his library. His civility was therefore most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to enjoy a walk with his daughters, and Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his large book and go. So what does this one sentence actually tell us? What do we gather about number one, Mr. Bennet? Okay, so what we gather is that he's a guy who's living with 5 daughters, right? And he's sort of stuck with them in these 5 daughters. And there's a lot of nonsense, I'm sure, that goes on in his house. And so the only place he ever gets to be alone is in his library. And we know nobody's allowed to go in there without permission. And so he goes into his library. And now he's got this absurd, ridiculous person, Mr. Collins. He's got to figure out a way to get rid of him. So what does he do? He invites him to go on a walk with his daughters. And so we get to see that he's pawning him off on his daughters. And we also see Mr. Collins, who's this fake intellect, right? He's got this large book, but in fact, he's better fitted to be a walker than a reader. And so you see also what a joke Mr. Collins is, that, and he's so happy to close his large book and go. Leslie? Yeah. You're muted. Unmute. Yeah.
I like the fact that Mr. Collins liked to say that he complimented women, and he would tell them, that I'm very good at doing this and it gets me good results. I thought that was very. I also want to mention one other thing.
Yeah.
Do you see a connection between this book and Fiddler on the Roof?
Oh, in terms of the daughters?
Daughters.
Funny, I had not thought of it at that point, but I have certainly, certainly see it, right, between Tavia and this guy, right. Both of them, like, not quite knowing what to do with this house full of girls. Exactly. Right. Interesting, right.
Linda?
Yeah.
I think the humor in this book was wonderful. I absolutely really did love it. But one of my favorite lines of the entire book took place between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet regarding Collins. And when Elizabeth was having the conversation with her parents about it, and Mrs. Bennet, who's a bit of a buffoon herself, comic relief, says, I will never speak to you again if you do not marry him. And Mr. Bennet said, and I will never talk to you again if you do.
That's exactly right. Right.
Wonderful. The other thing that I do like about this book very much is that when Jane Austen is writing it, we are living it through her eyes. We're not living it through somebody who wrote decades or centuries later as it was in their point of view. She is writing so that we have it right from the horse's mouth. And I think that makes it very special.
Right. And we're used to a lot of historical fiction type of thing coming from being written currently, presently. Very interesting point. Yeah, it's true.
Linda,
Yeah.
it's Debbie. I also want to point out that I think that you actually said that Mr. Bennet had a man cave, or the
Right.
original man cave, because that's what you described, and you're describing his library. So
That's right.
before,
That's
so I
right.
just,
That's
when
right.
you were saying that, I was like, that was what I was envisioning. So I just wanted
That's
to.
right. Right. Probably every man's fantasy, as a man cave like that. Right.
Right.
Okay. There were a lot of really good lines in there. I love this one. Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet says to her husband, you take such delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. He answers her, you mistake me, my dear. I have high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. I love that. You could see this just gentle kind of mocking back and forth all the time. Great, great lines in there. So the question remains, why is this book so popular even now? And we've sort of started to touch on it. Marilyn telling us in terms of seeing history alive as it was being lived at that time. What else? Why is this story sustained itself?
I think it's pretty much a universal theme. It's what was then is not so different.
Right.
Ironically, on Facebook, on the 21st of April, this week, on popped the following saying from Pride and Prejudice. It said, I'm 27 years old. I have no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents, and I'm frightened. And I'm saying, oh my God, well, we know that was the friend that married Colin.
There's Charlotte Lucas right there, jumping right out at us. Exactly right. Yeah.
Facebook this week shows
Right.
how universal this book really is.
That's exactly right. You know, it's so interesting because what they're saying is that people don't think it's just nostalgia for the past, because what this is it's very modern. There was a relative of Austen's brother that says, I think her popularity is in her representing a world in its most important aspects, and it's a world that we all know. She may have lived in a world that seems remote in time and place, but the characters and their experiences and emotions are familiar to us. Jackie, did you want to say something?
I was actually going to say exactly what Marilyn said, but there's a quote along the lines of the more things change, the less they really do. And I think that's very true of this. No matter when it was, there's the sparking back and forth. There's the needling with the husband and wife. It's the guys looking for somebody, the girls looking for somebody. No matter how much we want to say it's not like that, it is. I agree with Marilyn.
Because one of the reviewers said she really writes about the interior of all these lives, and the interior doesn't, the exterior changes certainly around us, but the interior doesn't change so much. They say that we still do a lot of the things that are here. We misjudge people based on appearances. Just like these daughters are embarrassed by their parents, many times Mrs. Bennet embarrasses them. How many of us have had our kids say to us, oh, don't pull up to the school, let me out a block before the school. You know, they're so afraid we're going to embarrass them in some way. Or the idea that characters flirt and fall in love and make hasty, bad decisions. All of that is in this kind of story and certainly in our world today. What's so great about it is that these, it says here, the social restrictions in this book can be translated into any environment, such as a California high school in the story Clueless. Does anyone remember the movie Clueless? I guess that's straight out of Pride and Prejudice. Then there's also an interracial romance known as Bride and Prejudice. There were so many books written that sort of takeoffs of this theme. And you know what I was thinking about? I used to love the book, the story of When Harry Met Sally, the movie. Do you remember that? Wasn't that really the theme of this? The idea that they misjudge each other so totally, have all this sophisticated repartee when they're, in the car together. And in this case, of course, through the various balls and such, and then finally, of course, fall in love. What one of the reviewers said was, of course, so many of these stories have been contemporized, but on the other hand, they fully fail to capture the genius of her writing. And when you go back and you really analyze the writing, I always say that's the old English teacher in me, but when you look at this writing, it really is, it's really brilliant. Okay, so moving on. Eudora Welty wrote, Austen's novels withstand time because they pertain not to the outside world, but to the interior, to what goes on perpetually in the mind and in the heart. And it's for these reasons that Austen's work continues to fascinate, entertain, and inspire us. Okay. So the title is Pride and Prejudice. So let's talk about that. Where do we see pride? Where do we see prejudice? I sort of like the first title, by the way, First Impressions, but she changed it. Where do we see pride and prejudice? What?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, Eva, go. Yeah.
Well, the pride is how they had to deal with their situation in life. And the prejudice is what they had to deal with in the society that put them in that place because they had no money.
Okay, good. Exactly. What else? There's a million examples.
Well, everything they do, every place they go, they have to calculate and they have to study and how they're going to dress and what they're going to say and who they're going to talk to and who they're going to sit next to.
And how they're going to come
It was
across.
oppressive. It was oppressive.
And how they're going to come across. And in this case, of course, Darcy comes across how he comes as a very wealthy landowner. He comes in and obviously he's handsome. What else? How does he look?
Well, he's good looking, but he's not very nice. I mean, he makes that comment about Elizabeth, when they're at the dance and she's standing right behind him and says, she isn't worthy of me to dance with her. And,
He calls her tolerable. He
Right.
says to Bingley, you're really with the only good looking girl here, and he says, well, what about her sister? Bingley says, what about her sister? He goes, oh, she's tolerable at best. She doesn't tempt me, So Elizabeth overhears this. So number one, her pride is terribly hurt. And what's the result of that? She becomes totally prejudiced against him. What else? What else? I love this one thing where it says here, Darcy comes into that first ball and he's tall and handsome. He's looked at with great admiration for about half of the evening, till the tide turns in his popularity, for he's discovered to be proud, to be above his company and above being ever pleased. Not even his large estate in Derbyshire could save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance and being unworthy as compared to his friend Bingley. So right away we see that everybody's turned against him just from the fact of the way he looks at this first encounter. What else? So what happens as a result of the fact that right away, Elizabeth takes a dislike, everyone takes a disliking to him immediately. So what happens, by the way, why is he prejudiced against all of them? Why does he look down on these people? Why? Number one, why?
Because their station is below his.
Their station is below his. That's exactly right. They aren't landowners.
But also, Linda, when they were talking, the ladies were talking about his pride, Elizabeth said he was entitled to have that pride because of who he was and what he brought with him. I don't think they resented his pride. I just think they were entitled to him. I just don't think they saw him in that world.
They saw him as being just showing off, is what they said. They understood the fact that he had the title that he had, but he really was showing off. He considered himself above all of them. He looked down on them, first of all, because they were like in the country. He was more sophisticated than that, right? So they were country people. But also he looked at their social status because why? Not only weren't they landowners, but they were, generally speaking, workers. Right? They weren't just the inheritors of money. So a lot of them had regular jobs or made their money in trade. And so right away he looks down at the family, right? Okay, so he's got this prejudice against them. So now that he's got this prejudice, Elizabeth has prejudice against him. She's been insulted by him. She knows that. And she thinks he's just so high and mighty and like what's so great about him, right? So that makes her predisposed, this dislike of him. What does she then immediately make another error in judgment? What's her other error in judgment?
She accepts Wickham's view.
Exactly right. She accepts Wickham's view. Wickham tells her, oh yeah, he's a bad guy. He denied me. I was supposed to inherit from his father this whole big parsonage. And in fact, I didn't get it. And it's all because the father loved me more than he loved his own son, Darcy. And she believes it because she's already predisposed, right? She makes that initial judgment and goes from there. Exactly. Okay. So, all in all, what would you say are the themes in Pride and Prejudice? Obviously, Pride and Prejudice. What else?
Marriage.
Marriage. What else?
Class.
What?
Class distinction.
Class distinctions. Exactly. What else?
Family.
Family. Love. How about the role of women? Now, I don't know how many of you guys had what I had in my book. I don't know. Did you guys, you see all my notes, look at all my things that I have little notes for myself. But in this version of the book, there's a wonderful introduction by a woman by the name of Vivian Jones, who happens to be a professor. How many of you did have this version and did look at the introduction? No? Okay. Oh, I guess nobody did. Okay. Anyway, all right. But I'm going to share with you one of the reasons this book has such power to continue being studied the way it is that this woman is a professor and her specialty is about gender and culture, okay? And she talks about the role of women. And what's really cool about this book is that each of her characters reflects. Did you ever hear this thing about when political becomes personal? That's the idea. In this book, the political became personal. She took each of these characters, and in showing us these characters, she is actually teaching us about what was happening, about the changing ideas about the role of women and the changing ideas about the role of society. And she talks about the fact that there was this guy, Burke, who wrote this book. And by the way, remember, this book came out, she was writing at the end of the French Revolution. So it was a period of change. There were revolutionary ideas being espoused, and there was also the people that were still traditionalists. So the role of women was very much in flux at this time. And so she talks about this guy, Burke, who was a traditionalist. He was sorry that chivalry was gone. He thought for sure that it should be a paternalistic society. Women were not innately as bright as men. They didn't reason. We only had feelings. And up against this comes one of the first modern English feminists, a woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. And she's a woman who says, what? Are you kidding? Oh, no. We are the same as men. We have the same human identity. The only difference is you guys haven't given us education. So we haven't been able to develop our reason. We do have it in us. We just don't have, culture has denied us all of the possibilities. And then there's a third person who came into the picture, this Hannah More, and she says, no, you're both wrong. The truth is we do need to have women more like the feminists say, but the women should realize that we are different and we don't want to do anything that hurts us in terms of the delicacy of our sex. She believes in the refinement and all of that. So the question here that Austen is throwing out is, who are these women? And each of them actually is reflecting different points of view that were happening in the public debate about the role of women. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some of these characters, some of these women. Let's start out with Jane. She's the oldest daughter. What do we know about Jane? How does she describe her, Jane? Do you remember?
She's shy. She's very shy.
She's very shy. Okay, she's very beautiful. She's the most beautiful of all the girls. And she attracts the attention of Bingley. Okay, now why is her shyness important? Is because
because she doesn't show this man that she really likes him very much. And
Right.
This is the reason that Darcy gives as an explanation why he told his friend not to pursue her anymore.
Right.
Because
So what this character, this whole piece of the story is reflecting is this awful idea that women are also very, for the most part, very scheming. In fact, Charlotte at one point says, we know Jane is just shy, but in 9 cases out of 10, a woman has to show more affection than she really feels. Men need women to help them on. In other words, women need to manipulate the men and get the men to move forward in the relationship. And Jane holds back. And because she's shy, in the end, she sort of has to suffer that bit of heartbreak when Bingley leaves her because he thinks that she's not interested, right? So Jane is making a point here, and a lot of this is all of these extremes. She's making a point that they're portraying women as most women being manipulative, and she is not. She is not like that. She's actually more, you know, she is shy. She's a little bit, she's withholding her feelings a little bit more. So we see her in sort of a traditional role. She's certainly not moving forward the way a feminist would, but she is holding back. We've got the daughter Mary, and she's very bookish, and she's very into morality and proper conduct. She's another traditionalist. And then we've got Lydia. Let's talk about Lydia, the 16-year-old. Where does she fall into this?
She runs away with Wickham,
She runs away. What kind of, what's her personality like?
like modern,
Like what?
It's like
modern
like
teenager.
girl.
Modern teenager, okay. Rebellious, right? She's just ready to go, right? Ready to, she's like kind of a wild kid, right? And so we see Lydia is breaking all the conventions. So she's sort of the opposite of Jane and all of these other more traditional girls. We see that with her. By the way, let's talk about Charlotte. She was an interesting girl, the best friend, the very good friend of Elizabeth. What do we know about Charlotte?
Very practical.
Very practical. She's a plain girl. What else about her?
Yeah, well, she knew what her situation was, and she said, I may never get a chance to marry again. And
Right. She
I don't
said
really-
that. Right.
Yeah.
Just like the kid on Facebook. I'm a burden to my parents at this point, right? And I love the way she looks at marriage, because that was a very typical way of looking at marriage. She says, not everyone can afford to look for a romantic relationship in a marriage. She realizes that she is almost unmarriageable at the ripe old age of 27. And therefore she says, I will be as happy with him as I would be with any other. So she's just as practical as can be. She realizes that she needs to make her way in the world. And the only way to make her way is how? Marriage, exactly, is to be married, exactly. One of my favorite characters was Caroline Bingley. How'd you feel about her, Mr. Bingley's sister?
Little bitch.
Oh, I loved it. Right, exactly. That's the other thing about Jane Austen. She tells it like it is, and the personalities don't change. We all know people like this. We've all had girlfriends probably like this when we were growing up. Hopefully we shed them along the way, but they were tough characters. Why? What's the story with Carolyn?
She was interested in Darcy.
She wanted Darcy, exactly. What else about Carolyn? What were some of the scenes or ways that we describe her? I really thought she was a great character. First of all, a very pivotal scene, guys. Do you remember this one scene where now Jane, Mrs. Bennet, is very clever. We're going to talk about her in a little bit, but she's very clever. She sends Jane over to Netherfield, not in a carriage, because she's hoping it's going to rain and Jane will have to spend more time there, right? Because she's now going to try to make this arrangement with Bingley and Jane. Turns out Jane gets sick and she ends up staying there for several days. And Elizabeth is worried about her sister and she walks miles over to get to see her sick sister. Okay, what's Caroline's reaction to that? Picture she's really what? She's the traditionalist. She's very into decorum. And she takes one look at Jane and she sees Darcy is looking at Elizabeth. Darcy is looking at Elizabeth in a different way. He sees she's come in, she's had this long walk. He says, Caroline starts to say some bad stuff about her. And he says, yeah, but you know what? Her eyes were so bright and her complexion was she was obviously very flushed when she got there and she really looked good to him, right?
Right.
And so Caroline says very disdainfully, oh, walking several miles alone, getting above her ankles in dirt, seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country indifference to decorum. So Caroline is trying to put her down in Darcy's view, and Darcy, he really kind of doesn't see that at all. He's looking at this as a big positive. I love another thing that Caroline does. Nobody remembers any more scenes with Caroline? Okay, this one you're going to remember. She says, Caroline says to Elizabeth when they're together, okay, so you know what? They're sitting with Darcy. Let's take a stroll around the room. Do you remember that? Let's take a stroll around the room. And then Caroline says to Darcy, why don't you join us? And he says, no, I don't want to. I have a reason for not wanting to. She falls for it and she says, well, why don't you want to walk with us? And he says, well, you two girls would only be walking for one reason. And that is, it would be to either share confidences or to just let me appreciate your figures, the way you look when you're walking. And either way, he says, you know what, I will appreciate your figures sitting here by the fire. So Darcy really sees through her, but she's got her ways of trying to do what she can to attract Darcy. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, what do we want to say about her?
The matron.
She what? I missed it. Say it again. Lady Catherine.
She's like the matron of the family. She's powerful and
She's powerful. She's the aristocracy.
Yeah.
So again,
wealthy.
Exactly. Jane Austen is really making a point with her and showing she's the example of the aristocracy, and why she's a really important example. Nobody dares to upset her. She represents the old order. And in the end, she is powerless to come up. Remember how she comes at the very end and she says to Elizabeth, listen, I want him to marry my daughter and you're not getting in the way. And I want you to promise that you're not going to wind up with him. And what does Elizabeth dare to do at the very end?
Refuses,
Stands up to her. And so again, this is a point that Jane Austen is making, that the new society, the new woman is looking at the old woman, the old aristocracy, and saying, no, I'm not having part of that. And she's able to stand up to her. Mrs. Bennet is the butt of a lot of humor in the book, but the truth is Jane Austen makes a very powerful point with her. Even though she seems unbearable in her desperation, the truth of the matter is what they're saying is that she is rightfully concerned. There was only one way for her girls to have a life, not only to have a successful life, to have any life. And how was that?
to get married.
Marriage. And so therefore her goal, which seems so ridiculous to us now, what she was doing, was really the only response to what could have happened back in the day. And it says, one of the reviewers writes, if Mrs. Bennet is slightly crazy, then perhaps it's because she perceives more clearly than her husband did the possible fate of 5 daughters who do not marry. And so what this is really the extreme response to a real societal grievance that was people were starting to notice. What is this all about? That women can't inherit, that women have no route to bettering themselves other than through men, other than through marriage. So as much as we laugh at Mrs. Bennet, we really do get her, and we do understand what Jane Austen was trying to say. Elizabeth is a very interesting character. What would you say about Elizabeth? How is she described?
She's an excellent sister and an excellent friend, and she cares about people.
She does. And she's clearly the favorite of her father. And her father kind of has brought her into this sort of, when he's mocking the mother, he brings her into it. What else about Elizabeth, though? She's interesting. Let's talk about her. Is she, obviously she's very different than these other girls. How is she different than a lot of girls at that time? And what does Darcy see in her right away?
That she's bright and very intelligent.
Right. What else?
Very independent. She's
Extremely independent.
Not afraid to speak her mind.
Marilyn, what?
not afraid to speak her mind. She's
Not afraid to speak her mind, exactly. So in many regards, she's really an example of the feminist movement that was just kind of starting to be heard at that time. What else about her? She's critical of him. She voices her opinion, and he really understands where she's coming from. He's enchanted and charmed by the fact that she speaks her mind, and she's very different than the Caroline Bingleys that are fawning over him. And this is what strikes him. He's really taken with her in that way. Yeah.
I thought it was ridiculous that Collins thought that she would marry him. You know, I mean,
his proposal was funny, even the way he wanted to marry her. I mean, that he was really an over-the-top ridiculous character. Yeah.
he wasn't going to take no because he says, "Oh, that's what women do. You know, they say no at first." And she
Right.
said, "Get it," you know.
Right.
But I was kind of surprised he didn't try to marry one of the other girls, one of the other sisters.
Right. I think he was afraid to take his chances. He was striking out on several counts there. And when Charlotte really played up to him, I guess, and Charlotte knew what she had to do. And so she ends up marrying him. So it's interesting about this whole thing about feminists, and a lot of the background material about Elizabeth is, we see with her that she is a feminist to a point. But at the very end, what does she end up doing, which is sort of interesting? What does she do at the end? She's got this wonderful mind, this wonderful independence. What makes her fall in love with Darcy at the end?
She looks at all the facts. She
She sees all the facts clearly. She's able to say, uh-oh, I made a misjudgment.
Right.
She clears up her mistake. Exactly. She's able to see the goodness in him. Right. Right. Exactly.
I think that
But I
all
think
Marilyn,
it
did you have
started
something?
with the letter.
Wait 1 second. Marilyn, go ahead.
I think that with all these things that we're talking about, I really see that these two characters had the most change in them than any other characters. And by seeing the possibility of change and becoming, you know, who they are now becoming, I think was very appealing in each of the other's eyes about each other.
Exactly. I think that's really so much the whole power of this book is talking about exactly that, the change in these characters, the idea that the idea of first impressions being faulty and then needing to make the changes necessary in order to make things work, in order to see the goodness in people or whatever. Yeah. Any other comments? Yeah, about Elizabeth and Darcy.
I think when she went with her aunt and uncle to visit the estate, not thinking that he was there, and not only did she see the estate and what she had turned down, but also the housekeeper had such wonderful things to say about Darcy.
Yes.
And I think that was the beginning of her seeing a change, you know, that her first impression was not correct.
Right,
I
exactly.
think it started there when she visited the estate with the
It did.
aunt and uncle, and they thought he was rather charming.
Right. The aunt and uncle really liked him a lot. And also the fact that the housekeeper thought so positively, and she never could understand why Bingley, who's such a nice guy, what did he see in him? All of a sudden she's starting to, and then she reads over his letter where he tells how Wickham had lied, and she realizes she had seen everything. She was predisposed to thinking poorly of him, and she realizes it. She's able to pore over that letter and realize all of the error of her ways. And in much the same way, he's able to look at the way he went into his experience when he met all these people, and he sees that he was wrong also in the very beginning. But the other thing I thought was very interesting about Elizabeth, she goes to Pemberley. And I think there's actually a line in there that I'm trying to find in my notes where they say, when did you start to fall in love with him? When did you realize you were in love? And she says, and I can't find it, but it was sort of when she went
saw the estate.
So when she saw his estate. And so on the one hand, you think, oh yeah, right. Well, of course, that's when she fell for him, when she saw this largesse. But on the other hand, she realizes how many people he affects. He affects their happiness. He's responsible for all these people and all he does. And she realizes she too can affect this kind of change in people, this kind of happiness in people. She can do that. How can she do it? The only way she can do that
By
as a
joining.
woman
Mhm.
is by joining forces with him and being a mistress at Pemberley. So she sees it not so much as personal gain and wealth, but she sees it in terms of all that she can accomplish. And as a woman, the only way you can accomplish anything is, of course, through marriage, through a man. Exactly.
Linda,
Yeah, go ahead.
talk about money. I never saw her as materialistic, money for money's sake, which I think if a book was written
There, we got it finally.
on the materialism,
Right.
and I agree with what you just said, that she saw having access to that lifestyle is what good that she would be able to do, not about what she could buy.
Not her own personal gain. Yeah, it was the only way she could affect any kind of positive change or any kind of things like that. Exactly.
You don't want to know.
Okay, I think
I
somebody needs to mute themselves. Yeah.
Linda,
Okay.
I
Yes.
just want to say, I think her thought about him, it started to change with the letter, because she read the letter so many times and she thought, well, I was wrong. You know, I saw him in a different way. He's not like this, you know. I had the wrong idea about him.
Yeah.
I think so. Do you agree with that, or?
I do, totally. I think so. As a matter of fact, you make such a good point. Because she says when she first reads the letter, she reads it and dismisses it. And then she reads it over again. She pores over it. I think they use that language. She pores over the letter. She realizes that absolutely she misjudged him. And she all of a sudden sees so clearly what he's describing in the letter about Wickham and how she really miscalled that. So then why does it that Darcy, why does he get involved with Lydia trying to find, why does he do that? Why does he secretly go into action and find
Because
Lydia? Find Wickham?
his sister had been taken in and taken away by Wickham.
Yes.
And he felt that he had not shared that, and that this happened with Lydia because of his error in not alerting everybody to the kind of character that Wickham was. And so he felt responsible.
He felt responsible. His own pride, because he thought it was beneath him to even tell that story about Wickham. It was beneath him. His own pride held him back. And now look what happened as a result. He didn't let anybody know how really awful Wickham was. And therefore he enabled Wickham to do what he did. And he took Lydia. Why did he take Lydia? Why did he run off with Lydia, Wickham? Why do you think he went off with Lydia?
To begin with, that was the kind of person he was.
Yes, he was just a bad guy. He took her off. She was a young girl, an innocent girl, fallen for him.
Right.
But in a way, I also wondered if it wasn't his way of getting back at Darcy. Did you think so? It was his way of also getting back at Darcy. Didn't work the first time, and by the way, in the end, he did win, didn't he? Because what happened at the very end? What does Darcy end up doing at the very end?
Paying him
off, giving him exactly what he wanted. No, he didn't get the fortune from the family, from Lydia's family, but he sure made off pretty well, because Darcy was now going to pay him yearly, an annual income, plus pay him to marry her, and there was all kinds of money, pay off all those debts. And so Darcy still had to play into his hand, right? And he still was the winner in that. But of course, we know, why did Darcy do this? Why does Darcy do it? And Lydia and Elizabeth finally realizes it. Why did he do it? Yes, he felt guilty as he hadn't told. What else?
Because he loves Elizabeth.
He's endearing himself to Elizabeth.
That's right. Yeah.
But he didn't want her to know. He did it anonymously. But of course it came out right from Lydia, actually.
Yeah, from Lydia, who was really brainless as well as everything else. Exactly. Right. So Lydia goes ahead and tells about his intervention. But in the meantime, you realize he's really a good guy. He takes the responsibility. And at that time, he doesn't even know that Elizabeth will agree to marry him. But of course, Elizabeth has at this point realized all of her errors in judgment. And she, of course, is desperate and hoping that they can still end up together. And really, to Darcy's credit, he can't stand Wickham, and now it's going to be his brother-in-law. So she's thinking, oh my God, Elizabeth thinks for sure now he's not going to come back to me because he doesn't want this guy as the brother-in-law. Well, we see that, of course, Darcy does.
And in the
So,
end, when right at the end of the book, when they were wrapping it up,
yeah,
he invited Lydia to come back and stay with them as a family, because family was, but Wickham never was invited.
Did Wickham come at the end?
No.
Okay.
I don't think Wickham was invited back to their estates. I think
No, Lydia would be invited.
Remember, but because what I was going to say is one of the things that's so amazing about this story is not only did she take all of these women characters and give them larger than life, you know, in terms of talking about the role of women, she did that with the characters in terms of society. So what she's really showing is that marriage was a social institution in those days. And so what you saw was you had these marriages that had to happen because these girls needed financial support, right? But also at the very end, you see where the whole social order changes in this story, because you've got Darcy, who represents the landowner, and he has to work together with whom? Who does he do this with, the negotiation, to save Lydia?
the brother.
With the brother, exactly, the brother-in-law, whatever, Gardner. And Gardner was like a lawyer or something. He was a businessman or a lawyer. And so he works together with the landowner. So what you're really seeing is a merging of these social classes. She's showing that it took the two of them to work together. And what were they able to do at the very end? Establish a social order where not only in this story do we have a family that gets together, you've got all the parents, you've got Lydia, you've got everybody together, but on the larger scope, what Jane Austen is showing is you've got this landowner together with the professional guys. Together, they're able to establish social order. So she's really not only writing a story about individual characters, but it's also so much of a description of society, the role of women, all of these things together, as well as an entertaining, romantic story. Any other thoughts that you want to share? I thought, just to kind of close, I don't know how our time is. I'm always thinking about that. But one of the questions that I thought we would want to talk about is, she was a great observer of human nature. So the question is, what has changed and what remains the same, either in terms of human nature, societal conventions? What strikes you? Why the timelessness of this story? And I was thinking of Pride and Prejudice. The whole idea that prejudice, in that today we have prejudice. Prejudice exhibits itself today in which ways? How?
Racism,
religious prejudice, right? All of those kinds of prejudices. And at that time, what was the prejudice against? It wasn't racism then, overtly. What was it in this story? What was the prejudice?
Class.
Class. The whole idea of class, exactly. But almost like it's in human nature, the idea, did you have to look down at somebody? Is that what? I don't know.
Pecking
That's kind
order.
of an interesting, kind of a philosophical question, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Difference in the level of civility.
The level of civility.
Wars, it's like, oh boy, give me that back.
Okay, so how has level of civility changed?
How much time do you have?
What? Marilyn, say it again.
How much time do you have?
Right.
How much time? Yeah, exactly right. Okay. The level of civility has certainly changed. What else? What stays the same?
Well, I think
The whole view of marriage. The whole view of marriage
Right.
today is so different,
and,
right?
and family and parents protecting kids.
Yeah. Yeah, so many things have changed. On the other hand, human nature is the one thing that has to change.
Say the
You know,
same.
the whole idea of falling in love and practical issues, all of that.
Worrying
think
about
that
what the
all-
neighbors, worrying about what the neighbors think.
Worrying about the neighbors and what they think. I thought
Right.
the ending was so fascinating with Lydia. All of a sudden, she has done something so unheard of. She runs off, she marries this guy, and she only marries him out of total, she knows most of the details. That she doesn't know all the details, but she knows that Wickham was sort of bribed to marry her or whatever.
Doesn't care.
But in the end, the mother is so happy. She can't wait to tell her friends. She's not ashamed. Because why? Marriage was so powerful in those days that it superseded everything else, right? There was no shame, there was nothing else. It was really the idea that her girls were married. That was the most important thing. Yeah. Any other thoughts that anybody has, anyone wants to share about the book?
I think it's interesting that you're saying that marriage was so important, and yet Jane Austen never got married.
Right.
Right. And so what do you make of that?
And she was independent, no? She was she wanted to stand for herself, maybe?
That she was a very independent woman. She chose not to marry. She had the opportunity at the end. Now, she had two bad experiences. Remember, we talked about that. One guy died, and the other guy had to marry for money. Remember that? So she's very familiar with all of the ramifications that she's describing, all of these reasons why people have to get married. So she's experienced them personally. And then at the very end, when she does have the opportunity to marry a wealthy family friend, she turns it down. And you really see, in a way, she's sort of got a lot of Elizabeth in her. There was obviously no love there for this guy. And she had enough independence that she chose not to. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Did anybody see The Good Doctor last night? Because there was a reference to the fact that there was a woman in the hospital, and she was a virgin at about the age of 40 something. And she said that's because she loved her job so much. And what was her job? She did research on Jane Austen.
That's so interesting. No, I'm telling you, if I told you right now, there are so many analyses of this book. There are people that believe that they would, just to throw out a couple of odd things to you. One says that Darcy was absolutely clinically depressed. He needed like a lot of psychological help. That was one take on him. Another take was that Elizabeth hated women. That's why she hated Caroline, didn't like Caroline, turned against her mother. I mean, people are writing a thesis on about all these characters, and they all have differing views. And it's fascinating how one writer can have so many people writing about her. Yeah, Marilyn?
Without Pride and Prejudice, do you think Shonda Rhimes could ever have written Bridgerton?
Written what?
Bridgerton.
A Bridgerton.
Shonda Rhimes didn't write it. Shonda Rhimes adapted it from the book. But that whole Bridgerton thing, whether it was the author or Shonda Rhimes' adaptation, I don't think without Pride and Prejudice, I don't think that could ever take place. It was, to me, it was Pride and Prejudice in Fantasyland.
I'm telling you, as I read this, I actually was picturing the scenes from Bridgerton, many of the scenes, exactly. The clothes, it was all of that same period. And it really was Bridgerton without the R rating. Yeah.
Definitely, because it was King George III in both cases.
Right. Okay, any other thoughts? Well, wonderful. I hope you enjoyed it. It's always fun, I think, to do one classic. And certainly this has been a great conversation. So
I do also want to, I'm going to just do a share screen real quickly. Here it is. Let me see. Hold on 1 second. Share screen. Because if you didn't see this, can you see it now? It says Stories from the Violins of Hope. Tomorrow evening, we are doing a program for Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah. This is an incredible film. It's actually a film of a theatrical presentation, But what it is the stories are about these violins that were saved from the Holocaust. And each violin has its own story, and it's a very engaging and important program. And on top of it, we actually have live violin music as part of the program. So I wanted to invite you guys to come and to do this program with us tomorrow. It's Wednesday, April 27th at 7 p.m. It is a free program. It's open to the community. And we can register online, and I encourage you to do that and to be a part of that tomorrow, because it's going to be, we have a really wonderful crowd already coming, but I just want you guys to be aware and to come and join us for that tomorrow. So that's just a little plug for what's going on here.
Well, that's certainly important and wonderful. Thank
But
you.
it's a really wonderful film, and it's just with the music, it's going to be fantastic. So, in fact, I think the Israeli Consul General is coming, so that's kind of exciting for us too. So, but I want to thank Linda again, as always, for being our hostess with the mostest and giving us all the insight that we want and leading this conversation. And of course, we want to thank the Friends of the Sterling Road Library for partnering with us and making this possible. And most importantly, we are so thrilled that you guys are still tuning in and doing this. And if you saw, Jackie had put in the chat the next books, which May is Sparks Like Stars by Nadia Hashimi. June is The Personal Librarian by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray. And July, The Paris Library by Janet Skelsey and Charles. I don't know if I said that right. And the last one in August right now, Oil and Marble by Stephanie Story. So all coming up, and we will do them virtual. We will get back to you exactly on what day of the week we're doing that. But all of these books will both be virtual here through this link and in person at the Sterling Road Library. So thank you guys, and thank you for making us part of your day today.
Thank you.
Great to see everybody. Be well, and we'll see you next month.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.